All right, next up is Kim Brown to introduce our speaker for the evening.
Thank you, Roger. Sorry for the noise, guys. Didn't need to do that. Thank you, Roger. Thank you, Shay. And I should note, look around at the back of the room. Look at the people doing the work here. Hall of Knowledge. Take a wave there, everybody. Nora, Kat, Kayla. See all those people. And if I didn't mention anybody, sorry about that. But these people volunteer their time. They know their mushrooms really, really well. But don't be intimidated. Not everybody can know these mushrooms, as we're finding out. So if you have just a little bit of knowledge, if you're curious how they got to the name, what it is, anything about them, feel free to ask in the back. This is all for you. This is brought in by members. This is looked at by members. And there's a lot of volunteers. Well, let's see a hand. Who has ever volunteered for anything at OMS here? Yeah, look around. It's absolutely amazing. So I just want to say thank you for that. I noticed 2 people that didn't raise their hands, have been volunteering for years. But but I just want to say a thank you, and also raise your hands. Are you new to OMS, or is this your first meeting? First meeting, and then some new to OMS I'm seeing. So welcome in. We're happy to have you. So tonight, our speaker is not in the mushroom realm, but on a topic that many of you have been asking for, and I thought this was a good, fair, and balanced topic. And with that, I also have to discuss or to say a disclaimer. So I want to welcome you and thank you all for joining. Our club is a nonprofit educational organization. Everything presented today is for education and awareness only. We do not promote or encourage the collection, possession, or consumption of psilocybin mushrooms or any other illegal substances. Under federal law, psilocybin remains a Schedule I controlled substance, making unsanctioned use or possession a crime. In Oregon, there is now a limited legal framework under the Psilocybin Services Act, where adults 21 or older may access psilocybin, but only with licensed service centers and only under the supervision of trained facilitators. It's not legal to buy, sell, trade, or use psilocybin outside those licensed settings. Today's talk will focus on the scientific and educational aspects of the compounds found in psilocybin mushrooms, not medical advice or encouragement to use them. We ask everyone to be mindful of the law and to make safe legal choices. So with that, our speaker tonight, Randall Olson, is a PhD candidate in behavioral and systems neuroscience at OHSU and a former University of Portland psychology major. Interesting. He's been at OHSU since 2020, where he's exploring the neural circuits behind decision-making, working memory, attention, and cognitive control. His research looks at how psilocybin affects the learning in the brain and how different brain regions work together to guide decision-making. His curiosity doesn't stop at the lab bench. He's an active science communicator who's helped brought neuroscience to a diverse group of people. He's spoken at OMSI twice. Some of you may have seen his talk there, where he helped make brain science fun and approachable to the public. He volunteers at Noggin Fest. It's a yearly Northwest celebration of art and neuroscience. And he's talked in his hometown in Astoria. A true Pacific Northwesterner. However, he would love to learn more about mushrooms. So I don't know if he can really call himself a Pacific Northwester until he's gone out on a foray with us. He balances his research life with hiking local trails, teaching neuroscience, tracking down Portland's best chicken sandwich. So please join me in welcoming Randall Olson.
Let's see. Okay. And then I think I'm going to use this one. Hello. How's this? I can talk louder. I probably will. Louder? How about this? That's good? Okay. I can do that. All right, thank you for that wonderful introduction. Yeah, so today I am a graduate student at OHSU in Behavioral and Systems Neuroscience. I'm in my 5th year. I'll likely be graduating soon, hopefully. But today I'm here as a member of the community representing myself and the views that I express are my own. I'll tell you, I am not an active forager, although I would like to be. And I don't know that much about mushrooms. And I'm going to focus on the more basic in terms of the mechanisms in the brain that are happening, at least our best guess right now, of psilocybin. And that's kind of where my wheelhouse is. I'm happy to try to answer other questions, but that's kind of where my focus is. So, just so you know. Oh, we're already here. I should be there. Okay. So a quick table of contents. We're going to first talk about what are psilocybin mushrooms. Then we'll kind of look at what's so special about this compound, psilocybin. And then finally, we're going to go into what is happening in the brain mechanistically with this compound, psilocybin. And then finally, I'll end with a little word of caution. Okay, so what are psilocybin mushrooms? So I like to start a lot of times with the indigenous use. So psilocybin mushrooms have been around for a very long time. Kind of the most good proof of this is the codex belonging to the Mixtec people, is painted in the early 1500s. It depicts a sacred ceremony where diverse Mixtec deities consume sacred mushrooms prior to the first dawn. So this is kind of evidence that we have that. There's these mushroom stones that are also that date back far earlier, but this is kind of the most corroborated evidence we have of it. The use of various psilocybin species for medicinal, spiritual, and entheogenic purposes was common in pre-Columbian Mesoamerican societies and is still used today by Mexican ethnic groups such as the, I don't know how to pronounce these, but I will try, the Chatans, Chinetecs, Mazatecs, Mixes, Nahuatls, and Zapotecs. I'll just do a couple, sorry. So where we kind of go, and this story is not a great one. So from indigenous use, I'm sure you know there's a common trend of Western use kind of exploiting indigenous peoples. So for centuries, indigenous peoples have utilized psilocybin mushrooms for spiritual and medicinal purposes. However, the Western world's engagement with these substances has often been involved appropriation and exploitation of this knowledge. So one really famous example, and one that happens to deal with psilocybin mushrooms, is the story of Marina Sabina. And there are pictures of all of this, and I'm just giving you a wall of text right now, but she didn't want her picture used or commercialized, so I'm going to tell a story but not have pictures up. So Marina Sabina was a Mazatec healer from Mexico. In the 1950s, this researcher, Gordon R. Wasson, but he was a banker actually at Chase Bank, he kind of grew bored with that, and he participated in her sacred mushroom ceremony under false pretenses. So subsequently, he then published her experiences and the experiences he had there without her consent. So the exposure led to an influx of outsiders seeking this psychedelic experience, disrupting her community and leading to significant personal consequences for Sabina. So I think we should all understand where the Western culture got this knowledge and how they got it. So Marina Sabina's interactions with the Western world, starting with Gordon Wasson, have been described from an indigenous perspective as a story of extraction, cultural appropriation, bioprospecting, and colonization. Just to keep on going, is everybody still able to hear me all right? Okay, cool. So Gordon Wasson came back, and he actually, in May 1957, he published all of this in Life magazine. So this was the first time, the article was called Seeking the Magic Mushroom. And this was the first time that a broad audience in the US kind of was aware of this. So this kind of reached a broad audience, right? And then in 1958, right after Wasson published this article, he teamed up with a French mycologist, Roger Heim, and started cultivating Psilocybe mexicana. So that was the mushroom that was down there. And he'd take it from Marina Sabina, and they sent a sample of these mushrooms to Albert Hofmann. We'll talk about who Albert Hofmann is. Does anybody know already, maybe? Oh, okay, that's good. So Albert Hofmann, he's a very good, famous scientist, really coined with synthesizing LSD. So in the journal Experientia, Hofmann successfully isolated the two major compounds that were responsible for this hallucinogenic activity. So he determined this by self-experimentation of these Psilocybe mexicana mushrooms, and he named the two compounds psilocybin and psilocin. So I'm going to use them. I'm going to mainly talk about psilocybin, and we can talk about this later too. But basically, psilocybin gets dephosphorylated into psilocin in the human, right? So we basically, psilocybin is a prodrug of psilocin. So it just turns into that in the human body. And forgive me, I'm going to try to pronounce these names of these genera, and I would love you to correct me as I go along, and we'll see how many I can get right. I'm not going to do the species. I'll just do the genera. So there are at least 8 genera which contain psilocybin. There's a couple more maybe, but these are the major genus here. We have Pluteus. Anybody? Woo! 1 for 1. Okay. Genopolis? Okay. I could just do this the rest of the talk. Paniolus? Okay. And then I put these at the top and you'll see in this chart here as well. So the genus is here and then the species is here. And so the ones that contain more species of psilocybin containing I've separated at the top there. And then there's some more minor ones. Foliotina? All right. Conocybe? Oh, sounds like Canosabe. Okay. Okay, then this should be Inosabe, right? Okay. And then there's this Massapora, which is actually not it's not fruiting body, right? It's going to be on cicadas a lot of the time. And it has psilocybin. So it also has there's a similar one that also has, I think, a cathinone as well. So it's got all sorts of interesting drugs going on there. But we're going to focus, of course, on the major one that everyone is probably familiar with, psilocybe, and many different species, right? Cubensis is one of them. And there's about 137 of these, at least from this paper. These numbers vary quite a bit, but there's a wide array of species for this psilocybe. Psilocybe, sorry. We say psilocybe because psilocybin, we don't say psilocybin. Okay, so the species psilocybe is found across the globe, and there are over 20 species of psilocybin-containing species in the Pacific Northwest from 6 genera. I'm sure you've all seen them out there as well. They're quite ubiquitous in the Pacific Northwest. I do want to also say that psilocybin-containing mushrooms differ greatly in their potency. So we have psilocybe stuntii. So this is about, depending, right? But about 0.1% dry weight psilocybin. And then we can go all the way up to, say, like psilocybe azurens. See, I'm not an expert in these names. But this is up to about 2% dry weight. So this is about as high as we've seen the psilocybin content go. Some mushrooms some species also have psilocin. And I have a whole slide at the end if you want to talk about other derivatives that these mushrooms have. But keeping it simple, we're talking about psilocybin today, right? This is the main active metabolite that we're talking about. You feel free to stop me for clarification questions as well, and then I'll take them at the end. So just so everyone's in the ballpark of when we're talking about psilocybin and mushrooms, especially with new laws that are in Oregon. The medium oral dose of psilocybin is about 4 to 8 milligrams. I'd say a very large dose would be like 40 milligrams, which elicits the same symptoms as the consumption about 2. I would say the largest dose that, a high dose would be like 3.5 grams dry weight, depending on the mushroom, again, because of the potency. Okay, so that was my foray into mycology. I'm sure at least it maybe was entertaining. But now I'm going to do what I actually know about. So psilocybin as a compound, I study in basic science. So I've given this to rats and mice, and I've looked at the behavioral mechanisms behind some of this and the neural mechanisms as well. So specifically, I usually record in the mice, so I can look at their neurons firing and see how they change under psilocybin. So what is so special about this drug, right? What this compound psilocybin, everyone's all excited, everyone's here, why is it so special, right? Well, psilocybin is what we call a classical psychedelic. And psilocybin fits in here, as well as the D-phosphorylated psilocin. And then we also have DMT in here as well, and N-dimethyltryptamine. And then LSD is also in this category, including also probably mescaline. But we call them psychedelics, classical psychedelics, because they all have one thing in common. They all agonize or activate a very specific serotonin receptor. So as your keen eyes can maybe tell, this is serotonin or 5-hydroxytryptamine, so 5-HT. And psilocin and psilocybin and DMT all quite look like it. LSD does too if you squint your eyes and kind of outline this part right here. It's got some other things going on. But all of them are this classical psychedelic because they activate this sub-receptor of the serotonin, and we call it the 5-HT2A. And when activated, this receptor begets a lot of the psychedelic effects that we think, right? So good chance if you activate the 5-HT2A receptor, you're going to have psychedelic effects, okay? So all classical psychedelics activate this 5-HT2A receptor. And I don't think I need to tell you this, but in case, so we're all on the same page, classical psychedelics really are this category of drugs that really profoundly alter consciousness. And so psychedelics are these psychoactive compounds, profoundly alter consciousness, perception, and thought processes. In case you're wondering, the word psychedelic itself means mind manifesting, emphasizing their ability to bring hidden thoughts, emotions, and insights into awareness. Okay, but really the most striking thing about these compounds, including psilocybin, is that they produce this multifaceted and robust alteration in subjective experience. This is what we call the acute psychedelic experience, or a lot of times you might call this the trip, right? We're going to call it the acute psychedelic experience. So this acute psychedelic experience is often described as mystical, often described as substantially significant to the person, and is rated as a highly meaningful event in their life, often accompanied with dramatic changes in perception, including visual hallucinations and or synesthesia, so you can smell colors, say, so the senses kind of switch or blend. And then common themes of these experiences include, and I always like to pretend that we're running down the commercials for drugs and they have to list the side effects really fast, but these are a little bit crazy. So ego dissolution, loss of self. Individuals may feel a sense of unity with all things or oneness. Feelings of awe and wonder, time distortion, and intense emotional release. So this is kind of A lot of these terms are actually quite specific, and we actually have some scales for this, but this acute psychedelic experience is often pretty circumscribed in what people view, and they kind of accompany these themes, okay? I like to give you a couple quotes from Albert Hofmann. So he originally discovered LSD, and as we saw right before, he also extracted psilocybin and psilocin. And so when he first accidentally ingested LSD, which is a story for another time, he has these quotes to say about it. So at home, I sank into a not unpleasant, intoxicated-like condition, characterized by an extremely stimulated imagination. In a dreamlike state, I perceived an uninterrupted stream of fantastic pictures, extraordinary shapes with intense kaleidoscopic play of colors. So that would be maybe the acute psychedelic experience or trip. And then he says this the following day. Exhausted, I then slept to awake next morning, refreshed with a clear head. A sensation of well-being and renewed life flowed through me. When I later walked out into the garden in which the sun shone, now after a spring rain, everything glistened and sparkled in a fresh light. The world was as if newly created. So I like to share these two quotes because I think it captures two really critical things of the psychedelic experience. There's the acute part, where he's talking about kaleidoscopic colors, etc. And then there's this other part where in the next coming days or weeks, he's talking about how he's seeing things in what seems to be a different perspective. So there's these two kind of parts that seem to be related. And that's what we see often. So the acute psychedelic experience is often followed by a period, days to months, depending, of what seems to be increased psychological flexibility, which sometimes leads to relief from depression and anxiety symptoms. And we can get into how that might be happening, and that's what we're going to talk about kind of for the rest of the time. But this is a kind of shared thing that we as scientists want to try to figure out what's going on. So I'm sure you've kind of caught on to this idea that it does have this therapeutic potential, and we've seen this therapeutic reemergence in the last few years, right? And so this is psilocybin. There's two studies here. There's also LSD, and then ayahuasca. I put in quotes DMT. It's not DMT. It's DMT orally with MAOI, but for the purposes of us, we're going to say that's another classic psychedelic. And here's the publication. And so what the indication here is, and what we've started is like treatment-resistant depression, late-stage cancer, recurrent depression. And so these have been clinical studies. And then we have the amount of relief. So in time, right? So often all of these have been single doses. And then how long does this relief of symptoms last, right? And you can tell that psilocybin is about 6 months, LSD 7 or 12, and so it kind of varies a lot. But there is this amount of time where you just basically is a single administration, and then often it will last from days to months. Okay, so time and time again, often what we see is that a single dose of a psychedelic can elicit long-lasting improvements in measures of mood and well-being. And this robust therapeutic change we see from psychedelics seems to be quite unique to this class of compounds, right? We don't see this in other drugs a lot of the time. We just see it in this class of psychedelics. So that brings us to number 3. What is happening in the brain when we give a psychedelic? And I like to explain this at first. We'll get into the details, but I like to explain this at first with a metaphor. So this metaphor is from Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind. He's quoting Robin Carhart Harris on the positive effects of psychedelics. I then stumbled across this beautiful comic that I'm going to show you from Matteo Farinelli, which he illustrated this quote in this book. And I'm showing with permission. I actually contacted me. It was fun to talk to him, and he makes a lot of great scientific communication work. And so his website's here, and I put a QR code as well. But this hopefully will kind of show the metaphor that we're going to use, and then we're going to break down that metaphor. Okay, so imagine the mind as a snow-covered hill. Thoughts are like sleds going downhill, leaving tracks in the snow. After a while, paths, maybe habits, start to form, and it's much easier to follow them. If they get too entrenched, they can lead to maladaptive behaviors like rumination, depression, and addiction. Sometimes we need to shake the snow globe, a fresh snowfall, an injection of entropy. New paths, new possibilities, then suddenly become visible. Okay, you all know how psychedelics work, right? Now, mechanistically, you've got it. No, but this is a nice way to frame it, and we're going to kind of delve into what they mean about this shake of the snow globe, right? So they say you need a shake of the snow globe, and then these new paths form, or have the ability to form. So what is this entropic shape of this globe? So we can parameterize this as the acute psychedelic experience, right? That trip. But what is actually happening during the trip, right? During this acute psychedelic experience. So in order to answer that, we have to delve into just a little bit of neuroscience. And I'm going to oversimplify here, but hopefully this will allow us to kind of think about how psychedelics may mechanistically be working. So the brain, we have to realize, is this prediction engine, right? So we will understand then this prediction engine by examining an information processing motif in a very specific part of the cortex in these cortical pyramidal neurons. Now, a lot of words there, cortical pyramidal neurons, but they're aptly named. So they're in the cortex, so we're in the cortex, and they're pyramidal because, wouldn't you know it, they kind of look like they have a pyramidal cell body up here. Let's see if we can show the mouse. So this pyramidal cell body, and then they are in layer 5. Now, this isn't that important, but it's where they are in terms of the cortex. So there's 6 layers, and they're in layer 5. That's where the cell body is. And these neurons are very good at integrating information. So in terms of what we're predicting, all the time, I am trying to move through the world, and sensory information is coming in, and then I'm making a prediction about what's going to happen, right? So I'm standing here, I'm predicting that you're all sitting, I'm predicting that the wall isn't melting, right? That's a pretty good prediction. I see the wall, I know where everything is. So in these neurons, then I'm taking what we call top-down information, which is going to be my predictions of the world, what I think is going to happen, okay? And then that might integrate, or does integrate, with bottom-up information. And so this is the sensory information coming in. And these layer 5 pyramidal neurons have a unique way to integrate this information, both top-down and bottom-up, okay? So this information is integrated, and top-down and bottom-up information. So this integration allows pyramidal neurons then to combine what is happening, bottom-up, sensory input, with what should happen, goals and predictions. So this enables adaptive behavior and cognitive flexibility. So our brains are constantly doing this, and we're very good at it. And we can often change very quickly how we're predicting the world. In case you weren't sold on that idea, I want to show you one experiment that I think shows the integrative property of this very well in terms of the conscious experience. So we're in layer 5 pyramidal neurons, And we're in the mouse right now. So we're recording from mice in the neuron. And we're still using layer 5. And what we're going to do is we're going to use a technique called optogenetics. Don't have to get into it, but it's going to allow me to stimulate the neuron in a live mouse, okay? And so I'm going to stimulate up here where the top-down information should come. And in the conscious state, the animal's awake. The conscious state, this information travels reliably through, and at the bottom we get a response, an action potential. So there's no inhibition of flow of information here from this top down. Now I'm going to do this same exact experiment, but this time I'm going to do it in an unconscious state. Okay? So the mouse is unconscious, and we're going to still stimulate that neuron. And so when we stimulate in the unconscious state, there's no response. It does not get carried down through the neuron, okay? So something's gating information flow. So this is conscious versus unconscious, right? So we've got two opposite ends of the spectrum right now, right? So conscious and then basically unconscious. So what if we went somewhere in between that, right? What if we just messed with the gate a little bit? We don't have to totally stop information flow, right? But what if we just made it a little more desynchronized, okay? So a little interesting fact that I have to tell you is that, wouldn't you know it, this psilocybin, this classical psychedelic, remember, activates or binds to the 5-HT2A receptor, right? Now, where do you think those 5-HT2A receptors are? Well, they're actually highly densely expressed in layer 5 pyramidal neurons of the cortex, specifically. And they're in the apical dendrites, meaning they're at the top here. That's where, let's see if I get my mouth. That's where these receptors are. So when top-down information comes in, these receptors are messed with in some way. Now, instead of maybe total shutdown and no information flow, we're going to get this information being desynchronized. And that's, I can get into why we call it desynchronized, but essentially the information flow is now impaired, right? So I'm making a prediction that the wall is not going to melt, and now this top-down prediction is getting messed with, and now my integration of information is getting messed with, and maybe the wall starts to melt, and that's mismatch between prediction and reality, right? So psychedelics desynchronize then the integration between what is happening, sensory input, bottom up, with what should happen, goals and predictions, top down. Okay, so this would be essentially the acute psychedelic experience in specifically this pyramidal neuron. Now there's much more circuit effects going on that we won't get into, but for now, we're going to call this entropic shake of the snow globe, followed by the fresh snowfall as the acute psychedelic experience. And this is characterized by widespread cortical desynchronization. So when we shake the snow globe in this acute psychedelic experience, this information is desynchronized, okay? But there's an extra part here. So there was the entropic shake of the snow globe, this desynchronization, this acute psychedelic experience. But then there was a second part, right? With the Albert Hoffman quote. We talked about the kaleidoscopic shapes, but then they also talked about how afterwards there's this period of enhanced, maybe different perspective, or everything quote unquote shown in a new light, right? So what is that about? Well, with this acute desynchronization that happens, essentially we have before psychedelics, we can zoom in on these spines of these neurons, right? And take a look at the dendrite and we see no spines. I'll tell you what spines are in a second. Then after this acute desynchronization, this acute psychedelic experience, we see a bunch of new spines forming. One can think of this as the fresh snowfall, right? So now there's a whole bunch of new spines. And now what you need to know about new spines is every new spine that we have is a possibility for a new connection to be formed. Okay? So neuroplasticity refers to the brain's ability to adapt, change, and form new connections between neurons. This process is essential for learning, memory, and behavioral change. We're doing this all the time. You've done it all day today, remodeling your synapses, right? So each new spine then is an opportunity for new connections to form. And this increase in neuroplasticity has set the stage for divergent and flexible thinking. Now, this is not fact, right? This is our one hypothesis of how this might be happening. And this is what I think I kind of subscribe to, is that there's this psychedelic experience, and then that causes this increase of a period where heightened learning might take place. We can talk about that. And that then can lead to some of the therapeutic effects that we see, like alleviation of depression and anxiety symptoms. So the therapeutic chain of events would be administration of a psychedelic, desynchronization of cortical processing, that's the acute psychedelic experience or trip, some might say. And then this is followed by increased neuroplasticity from growth of new spines in response to the acute psychedelic state experience. And then we think that then leads to these therapeutic events. So essentially, when we desynchronize, we're mismatching our prediction engine of basically what I think is going to happen. And you can understand how that might cause hallucinations, right? Because I think this is going to be there, and then all of a sudden it's not, or I think I'm not going to see things fly past, and all of a sudden they do. I think that I'm not going to see all these colors, but I do. There's a mismatch. But this also can happen internally, right? So a lot of times we can think about a lot of mental illnesses and disorders as these threads of basically depression can often be an overfocus on internal mentation, right? I'm bad, I'm doing terrible, like all these things that are going in your head over and over again, causing you not to focus on the external world, right? And you have predictions. I'm going to mess up. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. I have all these predictions that's going to happen. And then those can be desynchronized, and a mismatch can be between what I predict and what happens. And so now all of a sudden I have to take a step back and go, maybe my predictions aren't right. And so that might be the start of learning new things and eventually moving to more behavioral flexibility and essentially alleviation of these symptoms that we see. Okay, so that's all the science I'm going to do, and I'm happy to answer questions about that. Got a bunch of slides queued up. I wanted this to be a little bit more question than talking, or kind of equal. But I wanted to end on a word of caution. So although psychedelic drugs generally have good safety profiles, recent systematic review concluded that adverse events in psychedelic trials are poorly defined, not systematically assessed, and likely underreported. In the past year, there have been multiple reports of serious adverse events, they call them SAEs, and long-lasting harms to participants in clinical trials of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. This is when you basically have a psychotherapy session and you also are under the influence of psychedelics, right? This can often be a synergistic effect where therapy is believed to be more useful, but we can talk about how that might also lead to more problems down the road, right? So specifically, this article was talking about how the psychedelic-assisted therapy stemming from the interactions between therapists and patients receiving high doses is probably the most overlooked category of risk. Because essentially, you have these patients in a very vulnerable state, and they're with someone that has the ability to now change their life dramatically. And that can be very good, right? But it also can be very bad. And it's kind of a double-edged sword. So we're going to turn up essentially the criticality of the brain, put you in a highly plastic, almost childlike state, and then that gives great power, great responsibility, right? So maybe there's going to be great change in one direction, but it can also go the other way. And so that is what we really need to focus our efforts on, I think. The therapeutic component of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy may present the most serious risks. Addressing it requires interdisciplinary approaches by researchers free from conflicts of interest. Often, a lot of these studies and a lot of the research going into this, there is a little bit of a unbiased manner that's happening, right? Where we're trying to push because we believe in it, and a good scientist is just indifferent to the result, right? And then finally, I want to end with talking about the indigenous perspective. And I know my place here, and I would love if anyone in the audience also has more ways that I can frame this in a better light. But as indigenous people have long understood, psychedelic compounds are to be treated with deep respect. These substances hold immense potential to transform lives, either for better or for worse. With great potential for change comes great responsibility. So moving forward, I think we must acknowledge that modern interest in psychedelics is rooted in indigenous traditions, and it is essential to not only respect these substances, but also to honor indigenous knowledge by ensuring that these communities are actively involved in discussions about the use, regulation, and commercialization of psychedelics. Okay, so with that, I will take questions, and yeah, thank you. I don't know if I should walk around with the mic so YouTube can hear it. Is that? Oh, that would make, that's smarter. Makes sense. Okay, yes. All right, let me finish drinking. So the question was, how does experimenting on mice, how is that relevant to human work, right? Yeah. So there are varying levels of this. And so like, you can be a translational researcher or purely clinical, and then you can go all the way to the other side where there's basic mechanisms. And we call ourselves basic researchers. And so often in this realm, there aren't a clear translational approach to helping humans. However, depending on what kind of research you're doing, I think there are some pretty good parallels that we can make. So we have a paper in neuropsychopharmacology that is in rats that we give psilocybin, and they're doing a specific behavioral task that we think requires cognitive flexibility. This is very similar, if anyone knows, the Wisconsin card sorting task in humans. And so essentially what happens is you have two rule sets, and you have to switch the rule based on the environmental context. So you're doing essentially for the rats, they're following this rule of follow the light. So the light pops up and they have to follow it. And there's two ports. So they're following it back and forth, and they get a reward if they follow that rule. Then all of a sudden, after 10 correct trials, the rule will change. And they have to, through trial and error, decide that, oh, that rule's not working anymore. I should try the other rule set that I know, which is side rule. No matter what the light does, go right. And then there's also go left and then follow light again. And so they change between these sets. And the ability for them to switch between these sets is very difficult, first of all, for them to do. It requires a lot of cognitive flexibility. And rats, when we give them psilocybin, the trials for them to switch, the amount of trials needed for them to change their behavior gets reduced. And so you can think of that in the human context of, I keep on doing the same thing over and over again, and it's not working. I'm still depressed, I'm still anxious. And now you give psychedelic, maybe, and now maybe you can switch your rule set quicker or faster. So that's kind of more directly translational because it's behavioral. We also then actually just look at what's happening to these neurons, and we actually know very little. And so, they'll say neurons go up in firing rate. They increase their excitability. That doesn't really mean much. So we want to look more specifically about what's happening maybe in these layer 5s. How is this information actually getting integrated? And how can we look at these circuit mechanisms? So this desynchronization that I mentioned is actually, we have a little bit of a, I'm not going to say for sure, but like a little bit of a neural signature for that, where it seems that there's these high frequency rhythms that appear under a psychedelic. And these rhythms are actually mirrored in also ketamine and some other, basically when we see a lot of desynchronization, that rhythm occurs. It's high gamma. And this is also followed with low frequencies dropping out. And we see that as well. And so those are things you can measure in humans with EEG. So we say, hey, we're looking for this signature. Maybe that'll allow us to titrate doses correctly. A therapeutic dose may be where delta rhythm drops out in a human if we hook them up to an EEG. And then we can say, that's the therapeutic realm. So stuff like that we're working on. So those are two different experiments, and we also have recorded in the rats doing a similar task, but it's unpublished. But it'll be out soon, I think. So yeah, so we're looking at, can we then maybe link the stuff that we're seeing neurally to the behavior? That would be the holy grail. That's what systems behavioral neurosciences do. So yeah, yeah.
When you talked about I just want some clarification about when the subject was in the sedated or conscious, was it in a sleep state or was it under medical sedation?
Yeah. So
For me, if it was medical sedation, I would have a question about drug interaction.
absolutely, yeah. So this gets tricky. Sometimes when there's no other way around it, people accept it. But it's a huge confound, and I agree. So in that particular experiment, I'm pretty sure they're under sedation in that unconscious state. So like how much of it is the drug interaction? And a lot of times, especially in early research with psilocybin and a lot of these drugs that are psychedelics, they were under sedation. Techniques have gotten much better. And so for my recordings, we always do, they're in vivo doing freely moving behavior. So they're implanted and then they wait weeks to recover and they have this implant and there's no sedation involved with them doing their behavior. So we've moved past that now, but yes, there's definitely reason to be concerned about that. Yeah. Often there's appropriate controls in place where you just look at the sedation and then, yeah. Yeah. I don't know of that literature. You could venture to say that it might help because of maybe this neuroplasticity aspect, but I think researchers are very wary to go outside the realm of where adverse reactions are going to be much, much higher. And I always like to think of psychedelics as really like the last resort in a lot of these disorders, where you've tried everything else and it's still not working. This is essentially the sledgehammer to the brain. And so like, for me, it's this last resort thing. So I don't know of that literature, unfortunately, but I would imagine that would be very hard to get approved. Uh, yeah. Sorry, the last sentence. Yeah. So the question is, you read a study, PTSD and psilocybin, and they mentioned in the study that for the next 2 weeks after administration, that you should be careful because it's possible that you might repeat the same behavior that caused the trauma, and thus just creating this cycle. Is that okay? We do know that after the acute psychedelic experience, there does seem to be a duration of time that is essentially of increased what we may call metaplasticity. So increased ability for your brain to make changes. And yes, because that same very mechanism is what we think may underlie the therapeutic effects, that mechanism is essentially like just increasing basically chaos. And so the ability for it to be worse is equally, maybe not equally, but also probable. And so, yeah, I say that these periods of heightened plasticity after the acute psychedelic experience are to be treated carefully, for sure. And I wouldn't be surprised if that could happen. We don't think it's forgetting. It's very difficult to prove that mechanistically. Memory is essentially this trace in time and space across all of these neurons connecting. And we don't have the tech to essentially do that yet. So we wouldn't know if that memory is still there or just like being overridden in a way. Yeah. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah, that's a great question. And like, again, there isn't enough evidence out there to definitively say. We are looking at like some synergistic effects in more assay binding studies that we have going on with CERT and SSRIs on board. And the effect really depends on the drug, and it seems to be complicated, and it's dose dependent, But, often the good rule of thumb is if you're increasing serotonin by a method, say, of an SSRI by blocking the CERT reuptake, and then also have something on board that essentially agonizes, again, what would be serotonin in its place, you can get serotonin syndrome, and that can land you in the hospital. So we don't know still, and yeah, it's a weird mechanism, right? That we simply don't know enough yet. But it's a great question. And like, I would say each day there's more people trying to look at those things. Because often people will be on SSRIs and then for, say, depression, and then they want to try psychedelics for treatment-resistant depression, say, and then they have to wean off, or maybe we'll be on them for the study. Yeah, it depends on. I would imagine that they probably are trying to get as clean of a sample in terms of like no other drugs on board, but who knows? Yeah, I mean, you could go read yeah, but it's not like, oh, who knows? But yeah, uh, yeah, yeah. Kim?
Randall, you talked about, or you mentioned some negative effects.
Yes.
What, can you elaborate a bit?
Yeah, I would say that really a lot of times when we think of this acute psychedelic experience, a lot of people will say that's followed by some positive things that happen. But really, what the science is showing is that there's just this acute desynchronization followed by an increased neuroplastic state. And what you do with that is your own basically motives, right? Or other people's motives or whatever's going on in your life. And so we don't quite know right now. It's like this is just a mechanism that seems to, in my opinion, kind of turn up the volume of what could happen. And if you're focused on making that thing good, that's great. But it's equally probable to be the other way, right? And so the mechanism we don't think really uh, delineates that right now. Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, I these there are certain disorders that we think this would help with more, and those are often disorders where the through line is rigidity. Um, and the help is flexibility. But when you're already very, very flexible in the most broad terms, which sometimes schizophrenia can fall into this over salience hypothesis, right, where everything's happening and you can switch between it, that might be not what you want. So a lot of times the kind of slice of the pie that we're trying to treat these with are disorders that have a lot of rigid behavior in them. Yeah. Yeah. So the question is, are you doing any behaviors that are related to more like neurotic traits, right? Is that, yes. Uh, Basically, running behavior for these drugs using psilocybin, say, really fit into a lot of times funding basically for depressive like behaviors because that's where we can get it funded, or we use this cognitive flexibility task. There's one in rats and there's one in mice, but in terms of testing neuroticism, uh, I'm unaware of a behavior that's clear cut to test that in the first place. And then giving psychedelics is a whole nother thing. So at least in animals, I don't know of any. And that would be, I would venture to say that would be very difficult to test. But yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. Is the increase in synaptogenesis caused by 5-HT2A receptor activation, or is it just kind of a side effect from activation? And there's other ways to. There's other ways to do it, and like our brain is doing it all the time. So I'm sure you've always heard like, we don't grow new neurons except in very specific places, some hippocampus, some olfactory places. But we do grow new spines all the time and prune new spines all the time and little connections everywhere. And we do change the synaptic weights all the time. And so this might help. I don't know. a lot of time, this is under the microdosing thing, which we could talk about, but a lot of times I like to think in gray is memory is the retention of learned information, and then learning would be the acquisition of new information or knowledge. In a systems approach, in a computational approach, you would call memory the stored as weights of synaptic matrices, and then learning would be the changing of those weights. And so we're always doing that. That's pretty much what our brain's made to do. And we can change those weights based on experience a lot of time. And so my best guess about what's happening here is we're introducing an extremely novel experience, right? It's not just going to Hawaii. It's, I don't think I'm like in reality right now. And your brain desperately tries to adjust because that's what it's good at doing. And so that desperate adjusting basically says raise all spines, like go into overdrive and make sure we're trying to be as metaplastic as possible. And then that stays for a little bit, and any behavior that you do might stick a little more. So that would be my best guess of what's happening. And there are downstream ways to meet to increase in spines. And so really this is one heck of a slide. So, you know, take it with a grain of salt. But there's these, I like it. You get to a certain point where scientists will just draw arrows to everything else. And then they're like, found it. And I'm just like, I don't know. But there is this idea that, you know, I'll use my pointer. There is this idea that 5-HT2A receptor activation by psychedelics, but also NMDA receptor antagonism by ketamine, kind of downstream through intercellular cascades, eventually both lead to the same thing, which is brain-derived neurotropic factor expression, which will increase synaptogenesis, is one theory. And pretty good, but we can't just give BDNF. It doesn't seem to do the job. So some things, why not just do that then, right? Doesn't work. So, yeah, I answer your question, kind of? Okay. Yes?
How randomized is that shaping of pathways versus perhaps a setting or integration
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, I don't know the answer. I'm not sure if anyone does. But I will say that 5-HT2A receptors, at least, are specifically expressed in layer 5 pyramidal neurons, apical dendrites, a little bit of the hippocampus, a little bit of the striatum, and in the claustrum as well, which I study. And so it's way more specific than, say, like an NMDA receptor, which is, you could bet, is probably on most excitatory neurons, right? So these receptors seem to be very specifically expressed, and we don't quite know why. And so we need to really hone down on what this pyramidal neuron is doing, right, in layer 5, and what the function is. And it comes back to the basic thing, right? So like, if we can figure out what the basic function of these layer 5 pyramidal neurons are, well, then maybe we can look at how 5-HT2A receptors disrupt them. But we don't know how specific it is at all. And we have really, it's very difficult. We can track individual spines with like, so we can, so the best paper out there right now, we'll look at this thing. I'll actually have a better one. Oh, what am I doing? This is nice too. So vehicle, DOI, which is similar class as LSD, kind of in the classic psychedelic, LSD, then DMT's over there. We have a better way to do this now, but we can kind of track these spines, and we can track them for that paper I'm referring to, not this one, but about 30 days, we can track a single spine. So we're like, it grew after this, and it stayed. And this spine went away. We have no idea, any clue what that is in reference to, all right? I don't know. Is it a scratch? You know, is it for the mouse looking around, and then the amount of behavior that's happened in those 30 days? Could it just be learning something else? Because they're always getting constantly remodeled, right? I don't know. So that's kind of where and that's state of the art tech, right? That we have, and that doesn't really do much. So. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
If someone has had a bad experience, does it
Um,
or do you just stop?
I can't refer to any studies that I know of that's looked at repeated, you know, like a bad trip at first, and then say a good, and then they do it again, and there's a good trip or something. Uh, Anecdotally, there's a lot of like Reddit forums, and you can read a lot of this stuff of people saying, you know, it's very common for people to have bad trips and still take it and have good trips. And often, and even clinically, we see, especially with ayahuasca, a lot of times you will not have a good time and be throwing up and whatnot. Often the adverse events at the time are still seen as therapeutic sometimes. And this is I can point to a lot of this happening, right? And so I would say this goes into the realm of, you know, where my expertise is totally not there. But yeah, I guess that's all I have to say about that. I don't know. It's a lot of personal preference and psychological needs and therapy needs. Yeah. Yeah. So the question is, I'm sure a lot of people want the therapeutic benefits without the hallucinogenic side effects, if you're determining the hallucinogenic as side effects, right? And that's $1 million question, right? So there is millions of dollars going into, that's where the research is right now. There's millions of dollars going into essentially trying to figure out a psychedelic analog that we would maybe call a psychoplastogen that can increase neuroplasticity, but not have hallucinogenic effects. I don't think it's going to work. That's my opinion. They found good evidence of tabernatholone, I think they're calling it. It's an ibogaine derivative that seems to work as expected in animals. Probably is going to hit clinical trials soon. But if we go back to the idea of it being a giant novel experience, I think it's baked in for this therapeutic effect to be messing with reality. Because at a certain point, you need the right tool for the right job. So if your entire reality is tainted by some depressive mood, you need something real drastic to get you out of that. And so that could be a lot of things. I'm not saying it has to be psychedelics. A lot of times maybe is a novel, you know, experience that you have. Going somewhere, having new friends, blah, 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 changing your habits. But I think that's underlies a lot of it. So going back to just making a fancier psychoplastogen, like, and taking it like an antidepressant, I don't think is going to work, especially since, you know, you just talked about the study that you have to be a little careful. You're taking this daily, and so now every behavior you have has the ability to change your behavior quicker. That without intention, that I would say would be arguably worse, right? So I don't know. We'll see where it goes. It's happening, and there's a much more famous Olson, spelled the same, that's doing it. I had no relation. Yes. Yeah, I kind of fished up this, and I'm glad you said something because I have slides. So, but so I did find this study that I kind of like. I would say so. This is a phase 2 clinical trial. So the design and intervention is there, and their primary outcome is this scale of major depressive disorder. So a higher number, 0 to 60, a higher number, you scored higher and more depressed, essentially. And they're comparing 25 milligram dose, which, I said 4 to 5, so 25 is a good amount, versus a 1 milligram. And then they have the 10 milligram over here. I don't know really why they separated it. Seems like statistically weird. 10 milligram to 1 milligram here. But we see a decrease in depression scores across the board. 10 and 20 aren't any different statistically. And 1 seems to decrease as well. But 25 is where we see the statistical difference, right? And so this suggests, at least in humans, that it is a little bit dose dependent. But again, this is just a single dose, right? And so if you're microdosing a lot of that times, that's 3 days on, 3 days off, or some in between where you're taking a very small amount, maybe 1 milligram over the course of a while. I did find this phase 2 clinical trial that just finished, actually. No data on it yet, but they just finished their recruiting and experiment. So we should see that coming out from the University of Toronto about what they might have seen with this microdosing. I will tell you in animals, we have to wrap it up soon. Okay. I will tell you in animals, it seems to be dose dependent, and the subjective effects of drugs up here in humans, the subjective effects of how long we think drugs last, and the amount of basically what we see is this critical window opening is kind of dependent as well. So the subjective effects are correlated with how long the therapeutic effects last, at least in animals. Yeah. Okay, we're done, or one last question? We're good? Okay, we're done. Thank you.
Why don't we?
Oh, yeah. Everybody's hearing me.
Great job. That was excellent job. Thank you so much.